Good evening, everyone. It is International Museum Day, so there's no better day to reflect upon the work that local history museums and all museums offer our communities as safe places for informal learning about the past, who we were then and who we are now, for providing safe and neutral places for contemplation and inspiration. 3 local museums have come together to co-host tonight's program. On behalf of the 6th Floor Museum's board at Dealey Plaza and our staff, the Dallas Holocaust Museum Center for Education and Tolerance, their board and CEO Mary Pat Higgins, where are you? Right there. And also the Frontiers of Flight CEO Cheryl Satterfield-Jones and their board. Thank you all so much for coming here tonight. You may actually wonder how 3 museums have come together to co-host Brent Glass as our guest speaker tonight. And aside from a very long and very distinguished career as a leader on a national level, and now serving as Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian's Museum of American History, our museum colleagues and the 6th Floor Museum are privileged that Brent Glass is working through the DeVos Institute at the University of Maryland and Bloomberg Philanthropies to support our organizations which have been awarded a Bloomberg Philanthropies grant. It's a capacity building grant. And we're very privileged to welcome you here. So this is our opportunity to say thank you to Brent. But Brent Glass is an established author and international speaker on cultural diplomacy and museum management. And he writes on a wide range of topics, from state-of-the-art museum issues and blogs to public memory, literacy and legacy, historic preservation, and industrial history. Brent led the 2-year, $85 million renovation of the National Museum of American History, which was completed in 2008. And he revitalized public spaces and created a new public square on the National Mall for citizenship naturalization ceremonies and other national events. He oversaw the conservation of the Star-Spangled Banner, creation of major new exhibitions on transportation, maritime history, military history, and the First Lady's gowns, and also installation of countless exhibitions and programs. And as you can see and hear, Brent has an extensive resume. He's an active member and consultant to the diplomatic, cultural, and academic communities, and serves on many, many boards that generate enthusiasm for history among the general public. And I hope that's why you're all here. His resume goes on and on, but I think I'll cut it short. I'll just say that Brent is a graduate of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government Nonprofit Executive Leadership, and he holds a doctorate in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he also has a master's degree in American Studies from New York University and a bachelor's degree from Lafayette College. 50 Great American Places is Brent's latest book, and he's going to take you on a sweeping trip of important historic sites all across the United States that you all must go and visit. And I am going to rib him. I told him I was going to do this because he did not include the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. He only featured the Alamo in the state of Texas. So Brent is going to sign copies of his book after the program, but please join me in welcoming Brent Glass.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for that wonderful introduction. I won't defend my choices of the 50 Great American Places. We can debate that perhaps after my talk. I do want to thank the 6th Floor Museum and Nicola Longford for hosting us tonight, and also the co-sponsors, Cheryl Sutterfield-Jones and Mary Pat Higgins from the Frontiers of Flight Museum and from the Dallas Holocaust Museum. You have some wonderful resources in this city and some great leaders in the museum community, and I have come to know these directors, Nicola, Cheryl, and Mary Pat, over the past year. And I have to tell you that there's no better group of leaders in the country than the people who are now leading these institutions. So I hope that you value them. And on this International Museum Day, we especially pay tribute to what they're doing and how great their staffs are, because I've had an opportunity to meet many of the staff members of these museums, and I've also met several board members, both at the Frontiers of Flight Museum this afternoon, and also the Sixth Floor Museum, and this evening I've met several board members from the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and we'll be spending more time there tomorrow. So I'm just delighted to be here, very honored to be here, and I don't take honors for granted. I have learned early in my career that we must treasure every time we're given an opportunity to speak to a group like this or to be honored. And I remember early in my career, I was invited to speak to a county historical society in North Carolina. And after I gave my talk, they gave me a lifetime membership in the society, a lifetime membership. And I was very grateful. At that time in my life, it was worth something. And about a year after I received that honor, I got a letter that said, "Your lifetime membership has expired." So I learned not to take these honors for granted, and to be consider it a privilege. I do want to thank in absentia David McCullough, who has been a good friend of mine for many years, one of the greatest historians that we have in this country, and he wrote the foreword to 50 Great American Places. And I think the way he captured the spirit of my book in terms of the value of visiting and experiencing firsthand American history, I'm just very grateful to him. And he was the one who really suggested that I write this book. And when I decided I was going to write it, he said, "Write the book that you would want to read." And the book that I wanted to read, I had three goals in mind. One was what Nicola mentioned earlier, to promote historical literacy. And by that, I mean to understand why places and events and people are important. Not just what happened and when it happened, but why they are essential to understand the American experience. So historical literacy was an important goal. The second goal was to encourage heritage tourism, to encourage people to get out and see these places and experience the power of place. And for any of you who have been, especially where we are tonight, there is nothing, the authenticity, the power of this story of the Sixth Floor Museum that the Sixth Floor Museum tells cannot be duplicated by a chapter in a book. So you must get out and see these places. And I hope that the people who read 50 Great American Places will be encouraged to visit those places and other places nearby or in other places around the country, excuse me. And the third reason I wrote the book was to encourage historic preservation. The places that I write about are preserved because someone had the vision and the perseverance and the determination to save these places. And in the essay that I wrote about the Grand Central Terminal in New York City, I quote from Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and I think this is an appropriate place to quote from Mrs. Onassis. And she became, in the 1970s, a great advocate for the preservation of Grand Central Terminal. How many of you have been to Grand Central Terminal in New York? Well, try to imagine that magnificent building, that magnificent space, compromised by a skyscraper that was proposed in the 1970s that was going to be placed right on top of the terminal itself. And structurally and architecturally, it would have been a tragedy. And Mrs. Kennedy Onassis at that time wrote this about in her advocacy for Grand Central. She said, if our children are not inspired by the past, how will they have the strength to fight for the future? And that simple declaration to me captures the value of historic preservation and also reminds us that history and historic preservation is not inevitable. It doesn't just happen because by osmosis or by inertia. It takes human decisions, human choices to make history and to preserve it. And I think I look around this building and realize the commitment that's been made to preserve not only the story of November 22nd, 1963, but also the building and the site in which it happened. And that's of critical importance. And I applaud all of you, and I think I'm talking collectively here to people who are determined and dedicated to telling the stories of American history and preserving our public memory. Now, how did I select 50 sites? And I know Nicola is going to press me on this subject, so I might as well get right to it. There's no excuse for leaving out this building, and so I will just from the beginning not try to make amends. But I will say I had four major criteria. Number one, I wanted to choose sites that represented every region of the country, not every state, but every region of the country. Number two, I chose sites that represented every time period from the pre-colonial times to the present day. Number three, I chose sites that were publicly accessible, either free to the public or a nominal entry fee. And especially in this year in which this is the centennial of the National Park Service, I chose many sites that were administered and managed by the National Park Service. I think that that's one of the great agencies of the federal government, and I hope even in an election year that the National Park Service is honored for its centennial and for the great work that they do. But number four, the fourth criteria is that I chose sites that reflected at least one or more of five themes, major themes that I believe have shaped American history and American identity. And those five themes are freedom, war, innovation, diversity, and land. Freedom, war, innovation, diversity, and land. If you can't remember that, it's FWIDO, if you, as the acronym for it. Freedom, war, innovation, diversity, and land. And the sites that I chose, and I'm going to show you a sampling, not all 50, but I'll show you several that represent these themes. So I think what we'll do is take you on a quick tour around America tonight, and then once I finish, we will. I'd love to hear your comments and questions and criticisms, and we'll talk about 50 great American places, and hopefully more than 50. So under the category of freedom, the Freedom Trail in Boston, which actually includes 16 sites. So already there are more than 50 sites that I write about in the book. I can assure you. But there are 16 sites on the Freedom Trail, and on the Freedom Trail, you are introduced to the stories in Boston that shaped the pivotal events that led to the American Revolution: the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere's Ride, the Battle of Bunker Hill. There are so many extraordinary places along the way that the Freedom Trail in Boston, I think, is a great way to explore this story of freedom. This is Faneuil Hall, which was completed in the 1740s and became not only a marketplace but a meeting place for the patriots who were assembling and planning a number of the events that are of the stories, the events that are told and preserved along the Freedom Trail in Boston. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia and Independence Hall in the background. And the Liberty Bell is interesting for many reasons, but one of the facts that I believe was interesting to me was that many of the sites that we're familiar with start out being something other than what they are today. So the Liberty Bell was never known as a Liberty Bell during the American Revolution or the early national period. It became the Liberty Bell in the 1830s when the abolitionists adopted the Liberty Bell as their symbol and their icon to advance their cause of the abolition of slavery. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia was cast in 1751, and it was to commemorate the adoption, the 50th anniversary of Pennsylvania's Constitution, which was called the Charter of Privileges in the colonial period. So the Liberty Bell is another one of those sites, and in Independence National Park, which is administered by the National Park Service, you are introduced to a number of critical sites of the Revolution and the early national period that formed our national identity and our national experience. The first bank, the second bank, the National Constitution Center, which opened several years ago, that tells the story of the Constitution. So I think Liberty Bell and the Independence Park certainly qualifies as one of 50 great American places. Now, one of my favorite places, who knows where Seneca Falls is? Anyone ever visit there? In New York, yes. And I love this site for many reasons. One, because of the powerful story that it tells of the Women's Rights Convention. The building on your left is the Wesleyan Chapel, which has been restored by the National Park Service, which is where the Women's Rights Convention took place in July 1848. The building on the right is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who was from Philadelphia, they were having tea at Lucretia Mott's sister's home outside of Seneca Falls. And they had known each other for many years, but they decided it was time to hold a convention. They were abolitionists and social reformers, but there was time to have a convention devoted to women's rights. And on 3 weeks' notice, this was early July, they made this decision. By the middle of July, they announced, we're going to hold a convention in Seneca Falls, in the Wesleyan Chapel. And 300 people came. Now, just imagine today, if we were holding a meeting or planning a conference and we wanted 300 people to come, we would start a year ahead of time or 2 years ahead of time. And we would use the internet and we would use fax machines and telephone. They didn't have any of that technology. And they had 300 people show up, and 150 people, including men and women, signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which they wrote during the those 3 weeks between when they decided to have the convention and have the convention itself. And the Declaration of Sentiments was modeled on the Declaration of Independence, but it included an important clause that called for the right of women to vote in elections. Now, we may not think of that as a radical idea, but in 1848, I can assure you that was a radical idea. And the story of freedom is told at Seneca Falls, at these two historic buildings and at the Visitor Center. And so I've included that story in the 50 Great American Places. And I also have a short mention of the fact that nearby Seneca Falls is the town of Auburn, New York. Now, who lived in Auburn, New York? Abolitionist William Seward, who was the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, but whose image is going to go on the $20 bill? Harriet Tubman. For 50 years, Harriet Tubman lived in Auburn, New York. So the last 50 years of her life, after her extraordinary career as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she settled in Auburn, New York, and her home is been preserved. And you can visit Harriet Tubman's very modest home there in Auburn, and then also see William Seward's home, which is beautifully preserved. So it's worth a trip up to that part of New York. And then the fourth site I'm going to mention, the story of freedom, is the Ebenezer Baptist Church and the Martin Luther King birth home in Atlanta, Georgia. And again, also another site that's managed and preserved by the National Park Service. Now, who can tell me, and this is a great illustration of the power of place. First of all, when you go to the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Park Service has recently, in the last, I'd say the last decade, restored the church, and you can hear recordings of Dr. King delivering sermons at the church. And then when you go to the birth home, you can go in and see the room in which Martin Luther King was born. Now, who can tell me what Martin Luther King's name was when he was born? Michael. Very good. A lot of audiences don't know that. His father's name was Michael King, and when Michael King Jr. was born in 1929, he was named Michael King Jr. His father took a trip to Germany with some other ministers. His father was a minister at Ebenezer, and they were introduced to, and he became very interested in the story of Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation. And when he returned to Atlanta, he changed his name to Martin Luther King and changed his son's name when his son was 5 years old to Martin Luther King Jr. And I think that's an interesting story because I think it tells you a little bit about the family and about the formative years of this great American advocate for freedom. Now, sites related to war. I had to include the Alamo. The Alamo recently has been included in a group of missions in San Antonio as a World Heritage Site. And so I think we're going to, I don't have to, I think, tell many of the people in the room about the significance of the Alamo, but it is one of those sites that tells us so much about the expansion of the United States, about relations with Mexico and the Spanish influence in the Southwest. And so the Alamo is a site of war. It's also a site related to the changing landscape of America and the expansion of the American empire. And that is one of our 50 great American places. Gettysburg Battlefield in Pennsylvania is also a place of the Civil War being the defining chapter, I think, in American history, and the Battle of Gettysburg probably the defining moment in the Civil War. And the battlefield has been beautifully restored by the National Park Service. They continue to maintain the battlefield and several of the buildings that were present at that time in July 1863. There's a new museum, a new education center at Gettysburg, and the cyclorama painting, which depicts the last day of the battle, a 360-degree painting that was painted in the early 1880s. How many of you have been to Gettysburg? I'm sure you would agree that it qualifies as a great site of American history, and the National Cemetery at Gettysburg is also the site of the Gettysburg Address, of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address of November 1863, in which he redefined the meaning of the Civil War. He begins the speech talking about the war being a place to preserve the Union, and he ends the speech by saying this nation will have a new birth of freedom. And he is talking about the abolition of slavery. And in that one speech, in that one short speech, he transformed the meaning of the war forever. I have a chapter on the Indian Wars, one of the great tragedies of American history. And when I talk about 50 great American places, what makes these places great is that they are essential to understanding who we are as Americans. And one of the great things about being a public historian in America is that you are free to talk about the triumphs and the tragedies. And certainly the Indian Wars qualify as one of the great tragedies in our country's history. On the left is the cemetery at Little Bighorn in Montana, where George Armstrong Custer met his defeat in the Battle of Little Bighorn at the end of June 1876. Ironically, that was just at the time that America was about to celebrate its centennial in Philadelphia with a great celebration, a great exposition. But Custer's defeat put a shadow over that celebration. On the right is in South Dakota at Wounded Knee, the massacre of Wounded Knee, which occurred at the end of December 1890. The connection between the two is that Custer's regiment, the 7th Cavalry, was the regiment that was defeated at Little Bighorn, and then later, when it was reconstituted, it was the regiment that was involved in the massacre at Wounded Knee. And Sitting Bull, the great Lakota Sioux chief, was present at Little Bighorn, and he was murdered 2 weeks before the massacre at Wounded Knee in an incident that foreshadowed the massacre at Wounded Knee. So there are some interesting connections. On the ride, when you're driving, it's a day drive between Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee, but you do go through the area where you can see Mount Rushmore and also the Crazy Horse monument as well. So that story of the plain, the Great Plains, the Indian Wars is described in 50 Great American Places. And finally, I include Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The USS Arizona Memorial is one of those places that commemorates the attack on Pearl Harbor, the beginning of World War II, the American involvement in World War II. The 75th anniversary of that event will occur this year in December, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about an event that has faded somewhat from public memory. I remember growing up, and whenever it was December 7th, everyone said this is Pearl Harbor Day. And I know that this year is also the 15th anniversary of 9/11. It'll be interesting to me to see how many people start to remember or not remember 9/11. And of course, Pearl Harbor being in Honolulu, it's not as central in our, it's not in downtown New York. So I think that may influence it. But one little piece of trivia, when they were raising money to build the USS Arizona Memorial, they were running out of money. And they were raising money, they were running short. Who was the person who did a benefit concert to raise the money for the USS Arizona Memorial? Elvis Presley. He was filming his his Blue Hawaii movie and his Hawaii series, and he was a great patriot. He was very patriotic. He'd just come out of the Army himself, and he did a benefit concert that raised, I think, $60,000, excuse me, and that completed the memorial at Pearl Harbor. Now, in the category of innovation, I include Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. This was the first textile mill in 1792 in America. Samuel Slater was a British mechanic trained in operating textile machinery and managing textile mills, and he came to the United States in 1791 or 1790, and he teamed up with some entrepreneurs in Rhode Island. And what I believe is very impressive at Slater Mill today is that you can see a great demonstration of water power technology and some of the original textile machinery from Slater Mill. And so that's an example of early American technology and innovation. Montclair Shops is in Baltimore, Maryland. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum is located at the former site of the repair shops that were built by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The railroad was the shaping technology of the 19th century. Without the railroad, America would not have been the industrial power, the unified country that we became. And it's interesting to me that on July 4th, 1828, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was being dedicated at that time. The same day, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was being dedicated in Georgetown, outside of Washington. And this is a great example of history is not inevitable. The people who participated in those two ceremonies had no idea which was going to be the technology or the transportation technology that would determine the future development of the interior of the United States. The railroad won out, but at that time, no one knew what the outcome would be. And the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum tells that story. This repair shop is the centerpiece of the roundhouse is the centerpiece of the museum. The roof collapsed in a snowstorm about 10 years ago, and has been beautifully restored and is a great example of historic preservation. Edison's laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. Thomas Edison, the great inventor, still holds more patents than anyone else in American history. The National Park Service has faithfully restored his laboratory, his office, a number of the research offices and mechanical fabrication shops in this complex in West Orange, New Jersey. There's also a reconstruction of the movie studio that he created, which he called Black Maria. How many of you have been to Edison's laboratory? He created this specially built building on a turntable and with a retractable roof so that he could control the light, and was one of the pioneers in many industries, but in the motion picture industry as well. His home, Glenmont, is also preserved, not just a short distance from the laboratory, and is another great architectural landmark. And then I bring the story forward to recent history, and this is the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, in the heart of Silicon Valley. The electronics revolution that occurred beginning before World War II with the development of the Hewlett-Packard company, and in a garage in Palo Alto, California. And there are garages throughout the Silicon Valley that were the home of Google and Apple. But it's also worthwhile remembering that the federal government had a big role to play in the development of the electronics revolution and in the computer technology and in the internet and World Wide Web that has transformed our lives in the 21st century. The Computer History Museum is located in a building that had once housed a failed technology company called Silicon Graphics. So the building itself is an artifact of the history of Silicon Valley. Now, in diversity, Mesa Verde in Colorado, southwestern Colorado, an example of the extraordinary cultures that developed in pre-colonial times. And another national park site, Mesa Verde, dates from, beginning in around 700 AD through probably around 1400 AD. But by the mid-14th century, Mesa Verde was deserted. But what I'm showing you here now are the cliff dwellings that were developed rather late in the occupation of the Puebloan Indians. This is Cliff Palace, which is the largest of the cliff dwellings. These are residential communities carved into the side of the canyons that are located at Mesa Verde. And it's an extraordinary sight to visit these places and realize without any advanced technology, the Puebloan Indians created these communities, these complexes that housed, this one in particular housed probably 150 people, and was a ceremonial site and a place where for at least probably 100 years was occupied by that culture. And that culture survives in many of the pueblos in New Mexico and Arizona. So there's a direct connection between the pueblos in New Mexico and the ancestral Puebloan Indians who occupied Mesa Verde. Mission San Javier. Now, who can tell me where this is? Tucson, just south of Tucson, Arizona. A superb example of a Spanish mission, one of the last Spanish missions built in this country. It was never completed. As you can see, the The bell tower on the right was never finished, but they stopped construction in 1797. So it was really one of the last of the Spanish missions. And the interior, as you can see, is just stunning, with hand-carved statues of the Virgin Mary, of the saints, of ordinary citizens and Indians from that period. And it is a active parish and is maintained by the Catholic diocese there in a Indian reservation south of Tucson, and there is a preservation organization called Patronota that raises money to preserve Mission San Javier. It was also, I should mention, Linda Ronstadt, the great singer. This is one of her favorite causes, is preserving this mission. Another example of diversity is New Harmony in Indiana. This was the site of two utopian communities. One was created by the Harmonist Society, a German Protestant group that emigrated from Germany in the early 19th century, settled in Pennsylvania in a town called Harmony in western Pennsylvania, then moved to southern Indiana. We're near Evansville. And I was just there last week talking about 50 great places, and they were included in the book, Nicola, I'm sorry to say. This is the labyrinth. This is a reconstruction of the labyrinth. It was very important for the harmonists to be in harmony with nature, and this labyrinth reflected their philosophy. In the middle of the labyrinth is a grotto, which is rough on the outside and smooth on the inside, and that reflected their understanding of human nature, that we're all somewhat rough on the inside, but we're all perfect on the inside. And the harmonists were very productive, one of the most successful communal societies in American history. They left Indiana in 1825 and moved back to Pennsylvania and established a town called Economy, just outside of Pittsburgh. And they sold their property to another utopian society, which was created by Robert Owen, a Scottish industrialist who had a very different idea of communal society, a non-religious vision. He brought in scholars, he brought in educators. His model was a very different kind of communal ownership. There was equality among men and women. It was not successful, however. And after 3 years, the community folded. However, the influence of both the harmonists and of Robert Owen was felt throughout that part of Indiana and neighboring states. I should mention, as far as what happened to the harmonists, they were a celibate society. So they didn't have a succession plan. And by the end of the 19th century, they faded out. The last of the harmonists actually died in early 20th century. And I was working in Pennsylvania before going to the Smithsonian, and the first state-owned historic site in Pennsylvania is Old Economy Village, which is a very well-preserved cluster of buildings built by the harmonists in the 1820s and 1830s. Another example of diversity is our diverse cultural experience. And Ryman Auditorium, which is called the Mother Church of Country Music, another example of a building becoming something that other than what it was intended. Originally, this was a church. It was built as a church in the 1890s, but by the 1920s had become an entertainment center, and one of the first most successful businesswomen in Nashville, a woman named Laura Neff, began booking various musical acts, and then she teamed up with the Grand Ole Opry, which was being performed on radio, a fairly new technology in the 1920s. And the Grand Ole Opry was performed in Ryman Auditorium from the 1920s till the early 1970s, when it closed for various reasons and moved out to the suburbs of Nashville. But in the 1990s, it was restored and now is again a center of country music. And country music redefined the image of Nashville. We were talking about that earlier. Nashville is now called Music City. But in the 1930s and 1940s, country music was considered a lower class form of entertainment. But as it became more popular and as different artists from around the country, Ray Charles, Bob Dylan, mainstream artists began to come to Nashville and record, it gained more acceptance, and now it is the biggest industry in Nashville and has transformed that city. Not only country music, but gospel music, other genres are locating in Nashville. The last group of images I want to present concerns the American landscape. And the land of America has been as much a shaping force as any of the other themes that I've mentioned. We have this amazing country with natural resources and natural wonders, and that has been an important part of defining who we are as Americans. Yellowstone National Park is the only natural wonder that I include in 50 Great American Places because it is our first national park. And the whole idea of national parks was an original American idea. And in this centennial year of the National Park Service, I'm very pleased to include a Yellowstone. And I tell a little of the story of not only of Yellowstone, but of John Muir and the creation of and the advocacy for the National Park Service, which was formed in 1916. Yellowstone was declared a national park in 1872. So it preceded the National Park Service by many years. So Yellowstone is included in this book on 50 Great American Places. The Presidio in San Francisco, one of the great natural wonders and also a place of great historic value. When John Fremont, the Army officer in 1846, saw the entrance to San Francisco Bay, he named it Chrysopolis, which in Greek means Golden Gate. And he said, this site, this entrance to San Francisco Bay will be to this part of the world what the Golden Horn is to Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire. And he was right. This entrance to San Francisco Bay was a critical place of military importance, strategic military importance, of commercial importance. The immigration to the West Coast came through Angel Island, which is just in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz Island is also located here. The Golden Gate Bridge, built in the 1930s. And I think this is an interesting illustration of historic preservation because on the south end of the Golden Gate Bridge, you see there's an arch. On the north end, if we had a full picture, you'd see there is no arch on the north end. The reason is under that arch is Fort Point, which was built during the Civil War and was built to defend San Francisco Bay. And as they were planning the Golden Gate Bridge, they said we must preserve Fort Point. So, if for anybody who's been there, I think you would agree it's a site of great importance. Today, the Presidio is part of the national parks, the Golden Gate Recreation, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and the Golden Gate Conservancy, and the Presidio Trust, which takes care of all the buildings that the Army had built between 1846 and the 1990s. When they closed the Army base, they turned it over to a trust that manages all those buildings and rents out the residences and office space and preserves the Presidio. So it is a great example of the influence of the American landscape. Willa Cather's home in Red Cloud, Nebraska. How many have read Willa Cather? Only a few people. I encourage you to read. She is a fabulous writer about the Great Prairie, about the land of Nebraska and Kansas and that area that was settled by the homesteaders in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s. And she and her family lived in this little town of Red Cloud. She became internationally famous for her novels, O Pioneers, My Antonia, Death Comes to the Archbishop, which is about New Mexico. She had this great gift for describing the land and the people, especially the immigrant people who settled in Nebraska and neighboring states at the end of the 19th century. And the Willa Cather Foundation preserves a number of buildings in Red Cloud that are associated with her novels, and also recently has acquired 600 acres of never been plowed prairie. This is prairie that has never been farmed, and they've created a little park there, and with modestly marked trails where you can walk through this virgin land in Red Cloud, Nebraska. And I'll close with a man-made landscape, and that is the National Mall in Washington, D.C. That is the first essay in 50 Great American Places, but it's a place that I believe every American should visit. The great landmarks of democracy are here: the Capitol, the White House, the monuments to Washington and Lincoln, Jefferson and FDR and Martin Luther King, and the Smithsonian is there, and the National Gallery and the great museums. And this was an intentional landscape, and it's a dynamic place, a living memorial. It still is a place where there are demonstrations, where there are concerts and festivals, and to me, it's a great example of our democracy. And I will just close by saying that the value of knowing our history is connected to knowing and preserving a democracy. We really can't have a democratic society if we have citizens who don't know our history. And you can't be a citizen in a democracy without knowing our history. So I am closing with a encouragement for you to visit not only the 50 great American places, but great historic sites across the country, and preserving our history. And it is one of the great assets that we have in our country. And I appreciate being here tonight, and appreciate your attention, and welcome your comments and questions. Thank you.